We are here today with the Honorable Chris Ford. He played a key role in shaping U.S. policy towards the NPT and its review process during his time in government, especially as Special Representative for Nuclear Non-Proliferation from 2006 to 2008, and as Assistant Secretary of State for ISN from 2018 to 2021. Chris, it's good to be here with you today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell me about your background and your career path. How did you get your start in arms control?
Sometimes it felt like destiny, and sometimes it felt like utter weird serendipitous coincidence. I'd always been interested in these kinds of issues. I'm old enough to remember as a kid debates. I was one of those wonky kids who sort of followed these kinds of things when I was young, and I'm old enough to remember debates over things like the B-1 bomber, the MX missile. I think I have a vague recollection of Jimmy Carter canceling the neutron bomb, but I'm not sure about that. That's one of those sort of not quite sure whether I'm remembering a story or remembering the actual event. Nuclear freeze debates, the Day After movie. So, there was always a sort of background in my head of like, these are interesting topics. I believe in my freshman year in college, I wrote an essay for the Harvard Political Review on missile defense and strategic stability. So there was always an interest, but I had absolutely no connection to it whatsoever professionally until probably 2003 or so, when, as luck would have it, a colleague of mine, I was on the Senate Intelligence Committee staff and working on entirely different things. If you had asked me at the time what I was, I would have said I was an intelligence oversight lawyer. Nothing to do with WMD or arms control or anything like that. But a colleague of mine there managed to get herself the job of Assistant Secretary for Verification and Compliance, as it was called at the time, at the Department of State, and graciously brought me along with her when she went there to be her principal deputy. So that was my jumping in to the weapons of mass destruction world.
And that was it for you?
Yeah, and it's not that I haven't done anything else ever since, but this has always been a really key through line in my career since then.
Yeah, hooked.
For better or for worse.
Yeah. Great. Well, you've been deeply involved in the NPT review process at various times in the broader architecture of non-proliferation diplomacy. From your vantage point, what do you think is the most enduring strength of the NPT framework?
Well, to some extent, the proof is in the pudding. I've got a file in my office of these now very dog-eared photocopies of the declassified and released national intelligence estimates on proliferation from the early 60s. And, it's something of a cliche in the arms control or the NPT world to talk about the cascade of proliferation that was expected. But it's true. It was expected. And I keep all these copies of these old documents that I've, annotated and drawn circles around bits and so forth, just to remind myself that we really expected a terrible situation to have come about, and it hasn't. So exactly what pieces of this, the broader set of institutions and practices that make up the global non-proliferation regime, deserve the most credit for that is, people will debate the answer, I suppose, but to some degree, the enduring bit is like, oh my goodness, we've actually managed to come out of this far better than we thought we were going to, and that is, if we can figure out what went into that, that is something that's worth preserving.
Terrific. Thank you. You led U.S. delegations to NPT PrepComs and engaged in multilateral diplomacy across 2 administrations. How has the tone and substance of NPT diplomacy changed between the mid-2000s and the late 2010s?
With the caveat that I haven't been doing NPT diplomacy for a few years now, and the big RevCon that we were getting ready for when I was finishing up my time at the State Department in the chair of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, that got slid in, for I guess it eventually occurred, but it didn't occur on my watch because we had all these, this little problem called COVID and everything got shut down. So I haven't been doing it for a while, but my impression of change over those periods is in the civil society and NGO side of things, where think tanks and various institutions engage with these issues, scholars and so forth. There has been a lot of, I think, very good development, and the faces that one sees around tables there are a lot of new faces now. They're very, I'm actually starting to be an oldster in this, but yet this is a community where when I was first starting to do it, the then oldsters went back even further than then than I go now. And I got the impression in the first few years in which I was doing this, I would go to these conferences where on the diplomatic side of things, it's the same cast of characters all the time, the same people saying the same things, and it became something of a joke with me and my staff at the prep comms that I could in effect give the speech of most of the other delegates there just from memory because I'd heard them do the same thing so many times, and I suspect they could probably give mine or some variation on that. I get the impression that was changing to some degree, but I don't know whether that is. I didn't think it was coming along nearly as fast in the diplomatic side as it clearly has done on the civil society and think tank side.
And in light of that shift, what do you think was driving it? Was the conversation just becoming too stale to sustain the process? Were there external pressures to really kind of reinvigorate these kinds of dialogues?
I actually don't know whether there were external pressures. The discourse did seem desperately stale, and that is something that I remarked upon. I mean, it seemed stale when I first showed up in this back in the mid-aughts, and if the impression for a complete newbie is that the discourse is stale and unproductive, that should be a sign that the discourse really is stale and unproductive. And I do think it was. I don't know the degree to which it has changed now, but I at least it has outside of the diplomatic circle. And that's probably a good thing, I suppose. But one of the reasons it's changed is that the context, at least I think it has changed, is that the context is very different. At that point, when I came into especially when I came into the NPT special representative role in the end of 2006, getting ready for the 2007 PrepCom, that was the time. I mean, it was actually before the Obama Prague agenda of 2009, but it was still the point. I think it was in 2007 that the so-called Four Horsemen, Perry, Nunn, Kissinger. I'm doing a grave injustice to the fourth. I've forgotten. Anyway, the four grandees of the national security community had their famous Wall Street Journal article calling for a movement towards nuclear disarmament. So at the time when I first got into this, there was a strong sort of zeitgeist of trying to bring the steady downslope that we had seen since 1991 when the START reductions first began, the post-Cold War sort of disarmament dividend, if you will. There had been, for years by that point already, by the time I came into this, there had been, maybe 15 years of movement where the enormous arsenals of the two nuclear superpowers were on a very steep downslope. One of my favorite talking points that I would try to use in NPT fora was to point out that our arsenal in the U.S. had now gotten down, and in fairness, the Russians as well, had gotten down to something like 10%, maybe slightly over 10% at that point, around 10% of its Cold War peak, and to the lowest level since the Eisenhower administration. And in a context in which, in the NPT discussions, we were always the butt of enormous criticism for having, failed to live up to our obligations under Article 6. I always enjoyed pointing out that if 90% reductions isn't progress, please tell me what progress is. I would point out that, if people took away 90% of your oxygen or 90% of your nutrition, you would regard that as a massive deprivation. So why don't we get at least a little bit of credit for having come as far as we have? So that was the zeitgeist of when I first came into this. And in that context, I suppose it's not super surprising that discourse was predominantly, or at least I felt, lamentably, focused just on disarmament.
Yeah.
One of my biggest beefs with the process was the degree to which, to hear people talk at these events, you would have imagined that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was in fact a nuclear disarmament treaty that happened to say a little bit about non-proliferation on the side, whereas my view was exactly the opposite. And that was the historical reality of how it was negotiated, all the things that people tried to put into it in concrete disarmament obligations, but that were voted down in the course of the negotiations, right? So one of my efforts as a diplomat was to try to reframe discourse to remind people that this is in fact a non-proliferation treaty. And the disarmament pieces are not unimportant, but if we can't focus upon and make progress on the core element of the treaty that is non-proliferation, then the whole thing will fall apart in a way that will also make impossible any fidelity to the disarmament obligations, because no one's going to end up getting rid of their weapons if you are seeing rampant, explosive proliferation. So my attention was always to try to get people to focus upon the non-proliferation side of things. But at least I understand why they were so focused upon disarmament at a time at which it seemed like we really had this possibility of a glide slope to the asymptotic destination of abolition. If the discourse hasn't changed now, when the world is transparently not in that kind of a place, then that is probably the most conclusive sign that the discourse is just dead. I hope it has changed to some degree. There is no way to have the kinds of conversations, at least to rationally have the kinds of conversations that we were having in the mid-aughts now about Article 6 and its relationship to the rest of the process in today's context, I would argue. And if anybody still is trying to have all those conversations, I fear they haven't been paying attention for 25 years.
Great, thank you. And those criticisms, this hyper-focus on the U.S. failure to completely disarm or to continue the project of disarmament, those were spurred on by the framing effects, say, of the Four Horsemen op-ed. Why do you think there was that kind of expectation? I was hearing some of these things. I mean, I didn't come into the NPT world completely out of the blue in 2006 with the special representative's job. I had some engagement with it when I was at what was then the Verification and Compliance Bureau before. So I guess I wouldn't attribute it certainly wouldn't attribute it just to the so-called Four Horsemen. They played a role in sort of helping ramp that up, and then it got supercharged further in April of 2009 with President Obama's Prague speech. But there was a good deal of that before, and I think a lot of it was just the fact that we were on this significant downslope. By that point, you had not just significant reductions, but almost a shifting to a new mode of arms control negotiating. I mean, I came to the Verification and Compliance Bureau shortly after the Moscow Treaty of 2002, which was a very weird beast because it wasn't really negotiated. As far as I know, it's the only arms control treaty that was never negotiated. These were reciprocal unilateral promises made by the U.S. and the Russian Federation that they only came back after the promises had been made at Russian insistence that they wanted for reasons that had nothing to do with arms control treaty negotiating, had to do with Moscow feeling it needed sort of bigger picture political reasons to have a legally binding deal with the United States. So they decided to go back and make it a legally binding treaty on the basis of the promises that each side had already done. We didn't feel it was necessary to have a verification protocol because it was our assessment the Russians were already going there anyway, and in fact didn't have much of a choice. They were pushed by their own imperatives to go down to that lower number band. So we didn't even think it was necessary to have verification procedures in here. So we had a non-negotiated deal without verification, and yet everybody was happy with that because it continued this glide slope in a way that felt like it was going to be happening anyway. So if you can have that, then you clearly have a sort of a broader set of assumptions in the arms control environment that we're in a happy place and it's getting happier, right, all the time. And people are, the powers are not uneasy with each other in the ways that sort of traditionally made old school arms control negotiating very challenging and difficult and sometimes not available. So the overall environment was just one in which it felt strategically, it still felt as if, now this may have been an illusion, right? I mean, in retrospect, looking back at things that were bubbling beneath the surface, both in Russia and in China, this may have been a very foolish assumption on everyone's part. But the general feeling was that we were in a strategically benign environment. And the task of the day was to negotiate our way, to continue to negotiate our way along that pathway. The world was going to play, going to have its last laugh on that. But at the time, that kind of an optimistic, assumptions of benignity as a framing construct for how to think about disarmament and arms control and non-proliferation, I think that had a very powerful coloring effect. And that would have been true even if the Four Horsemen had not written a word. Great, thank you. Is the lesson in all of this to constantly be prepared for change with respect to U.S. nuclear policy?
I mean, it's certainly one of the lessons. I think the lesson also, however, is that what it is possible to do, and the range of the possible and the available when it comes to diplomacy is powerfully conditioned by the environment that you're in. Arms control negotiating, as we saw with the Moscow Treaty, at the peak benignity, if you will. This is in 2002 would have been when people like George W. Bush were saying things in national security strategies about how, Russia is no longer a threat. And by the way, in the wake of these new terrorist challenges, they're a partner. And this is where all the big countries can come together in this shared struggle against international terrorism, right? So there was an assumption that we were, far from being competitors. We were, if anything, not legally, but in any colloquial sense, we were allies with our former adversaries against the threats that we cared most about at the time. So in that kind of a context, the range of the feasible is X. In a more competitive context, it's not that wide. And we, I think, sort of forgot that. And we have had a fairly painful period of reminding ourselves that in a more competitive environment, these things are a lot harder. My own personal view is that if the environment gets too challenging, it's not even clear you can have meaningful negotiation at all. Sure. And certainly our Russian and Chinese counterparts these days are signaling to us that they're not remotely interested in these kinds of engagement. So the lesson there, I think, is that, moderate expectations, the structure of the system, and the broader tensions and rivalries and problems in the environment are hugely important to what it is possible to do. And I would, and have for a long time, argued that those things are, diplomacy can do a lot of nice things. And, as a diplomat, I don't want to undersell the profession I've spent so much time in, but it's not magic. And there's only so much that you can do with earnestness and good faith engagement. And there have been, I think, a lot of over easy assumptions in the diplomatic and civil society world for a long time in the very benign post-Cold War environment that, with earnest good faith engagement, we can get across any barrier. And I think that's just nonsense. And we are being painfully reminded that it is nonsense now, I'm afraid.
And with that in mind, how do you know when a window for diplomacy or overtures will open? Are there indicators? Are there particular signs to look for, particularly in this environment?
I wish I had a great recipe for, goodness, if you see X, Y, and Z, then therefore you've got your opportunity. No is a strong term. I guess you don't ever really know. You perhaps always hope. And I suppose that would be perhaps the one recommendation out of that is to sort of always at least be in principle open to this and looking for possibilities. But in terms of how you identify them in particular, I don't know that I could identify a recipe or a formula. This is kind of Justice Potter Stewart in the Supreme Court many years ago. Again, I'm old. I remember these anecdotes, right? The famous pornography case where he said he couldn't really define pornography, but he knows it when he sees it, which is amusing on multiple levels. But I couldn't give you a recipe for when you can find those opportunities precisely. But I think if you keep looking, maybe you will know them when you see them. And there may be, you may be rebuffed. We spend a lot of time, in late 2019, when I sort of started performing the duties of the undersecretary for the last 15 months of my tenure at State, we began to develop what became known as the sort of the trilateral arms control proposal, trying to get the Russians and the Chinese to gather with us to have some kind of a restraining cap on our overall arsenals and try to find a way forward for whatever arms control needed to look like in the sort of the three-body problem world that we were clearly heading into at that point. And we tried very hard to engage folks there, but and it was not successful. But, one can be and may sometimes be rebuffed in making overtures. I don't mind making overtures as long as they're serious overtures, and that there's a real concept behind it and that one does not naively approach negotiating with the assumption that arms control diplomatic magic is this miraculous salve, the salve that's going to cure any blemish, right? It may well not work. There is benefit in trying because you might perhaps succeed, but even if you don't succeed, it's not bad to have tried. And frankly, as a diplomat, if you're trying to, as a diplomat in the sort of non-autocratic, what we used to call the free world back in the old days, there is also value in showing that you take these things seriously and are thoughtful about it and have reasonable ideas. And if the would-be counterparty is an unreasonable, evil dictator that wants to do bad things, sometimes offering good faith, serious proposals and having them rebuffed, that's not as good as having them be accepted. But, we were perfectly, it was explicitly part of our strategy from late 2019 onward that we would try to offer what we hoped was a reasonable trilateral approach. And if either or both of the other parties rejected it, plan B was to shame them as much as we could get away with, which they don't really feel shame. So that wasn't going to get a lot of traction, but it wasn't nothing. But also it was useful in terms of our relationships with others, that we demonstrate our good faith in this kind of thing. And plan A would be better, but we'll settle for plan B if we have to.
And it's a fine line, isn't it, between the United States being a leader in this space and the United States pursuing with goals that are not possible to be achieved or maybe not even suitable to the current security environment.
Yeah, I think being a leader also entails being able to and willing to and having the intestinal fortitude to speak truth to circumstance. And if there are real problems in the environment, being a diplomatic leader doesn't mean sort of slavishly trying to pursue diplomacy in kind of a mindless, arms control for its own sake kind of basis. Being a leader can mean, in unpleasant circumstances, pointing out that these are bloody unpleasant circumstances and pointing out where the problems lie and why this is actually hard. And being a leader, I would argue, also means if you are in circumstances where, and I think this is the case today, when you have moved from an environment of that sort of assumed benignity that I mentioned before into one in which things are really rapidly deteriorating, security and stability, deterrence, and indeed, I would argue, future possibilities for meaningful arms control can, in the right or wrong circumstances, depend upon doing things that feel very, very uncomfortable and out of place to people who have become accustomed to that happy post-Cold War glide path of reductions. I think we are now in the business of needing to go back up again. We have not been in the up business in the nuclear world for a really long time. In fact, it's not even just a post-Cold War thing. The size of the U.S. arsenal, I believe, peaked in 67 or 68. So I think 67. So that happens to be the year that I was born. So we have not been in the up business since, at any time in which I've been alive, and I'm not a young person anymore. It is a huge deal to be in that game again, and that's not a great thing. But if you need to be, you need to be. And a mindless adherence to trying to keep the good vibes of that, the happy feel of that glide path when the world is deteriorating around you is actually a worse cure than the disease. So being a leader can involve saying, look, the disease requires the following bitter medicine. And if you want to get back into anything more like a stable, happy negotiating engagement, sometimes you've got to bite the bullet and do things that feel very bad. That's a lesson we learned with the so-called Euro missiles, the deployment of the INF class systems in Europe in December of '83, after several years of deep NATO political pain over this. That's, I think, in many ways for arms control hawks of my generation, that's been a touchstone of memory too, where this was something that we were told was the most horrific warmongery thing in the history of horrific warmongery things. And yet this is precisely what was needed to get the Soviets back to the table, and which helped get us the INF Treaty in 1987. Many of us remember that from being young folks at the time.
Yeah,
and it's not
moment.
A coincidence that that language showed up, for example, in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, when we announced the SLECM-N program for the first time. The language in the NPR explicitly invoked the INF missiles, that history of Soviet SS-20 deployment, U.S. and NATO Euro missile counter-deployment, which was then the catalyst for a negotiated answer in 87 with the INF Treaty that got rid of the entire class, the only time we've ever agreed to get rid of an entire class of delivery systems. We explicitly invoked that in 2018, not for no reason. And this is where historical memory is so important. And there are lessons, I think, to be learned there. But being a leader can require, taking some tough, challenging, and straining positions.
Kind of your signature, isn't it? Really speaking with candor about the security environment and the role of arms control vis-a-vis that environment.
I fear it is kind of my signature. Not because others don't think that and do and have these views, but because I've seemed to have ended up with a role as in some ways, the diplomatic face of this kind of stuff. Most of the hawks of my generation don't terribly enjoy or do spend much time engaging with civil society and the disarmament community and things like this, whereas I seem to have been, I've ended up doing that. So I'm the grumpy, I'm Statler and Waldorf from the Muppets, the grumpy dudes up in the balcony, like heckling the performers all the time. I'm the guy who goes to the conferences and tries to smile engagingly and be affable about it, but basically tells them they're full of shit.
Yeah.
It's a strange work, but kind of fun sometimes.
It's been a tough sell, though, hasn't it?
Oh,
Speaking in your capacity as a diplomat.
Figuratively speaking, I have nothing but arrow scars all over my front. Fortunately, it's mostly in the front rather than the back. But
both domestically and abroad. Could you talk about that?
I actually had a little bit of a tough time essentially getting the running room to be able to do that kind of engagement in the first place. This was not something that came naturally to either the George W. Bush administration or the first Trump administration, for whom I both worked. There was not unreasonable, but there was a narrative. I think it was wrong, but it was not unreasonable. There was a narrative that, why are you engaging with these folks? Say the disarmament community, for example. They hate us. They will never agree with what you're going to say. You are, dignifying their terrible arguments by engaging with them. You're wasting time. You could be doing something productive, so why in the hell do you want to do this stupid thing of engaging with them? That was never my view, and I managed to persuade my bosses to let me be reasonably engaged on these kinds of things. I think productively, my take was always that, to some degree, especially if you think these are terrible narratives that are entirely wrong and misguided, it is maybe particularly important to engage with them in the sense that if you don't engage, then you cede the intellectual territory. And over time, what is just speaking into a vacuum crystallizes into the conventional wisdom, and then it's extra hard to make it go away later. So always having the counter narrative be there. I approach this to some degree. I mean, maybe this is because I'm a lawyer, right? But there's the idea in international law. It's not really a legal question, but in international law, there's this idea of how does customary international law form? And it forms through the combination of state practice and state practice that is done not just because it's expedient, but because on the basis of what's called opinio juris, which is the idea that you take a certain path of behavior because you believe it to be legally required. But it's possible for there to be what's called a persistent objector. And this is a bit of a wonky detour, mind you, but I always wanted to make sure that there was a persistent objector there so that even though the consensus of the room might be generally around one particular path with which I disagreed, that there was always at least a voice there so that on the record there was someone, calling out that the emperor wore no clothes. And that it was important to have that on the record, and that, not just historically. I don't just mean so that there's a footnote someplace where someone, not everyone was wrong. But I just mean in terms of there being a little bit of a presence in pushing back and making points so that, as things changed, there would be essentially, seed corn planted for years. And I think we're seeing some of that right now. There are certainly some pieces. I mean, I know lots of people these days who, in the Washington policy community, for example, have come around to positions that I would have been shocked to hear come out of their mouth. Now, that's certainly not my diplomacy that has driven that, but I think having the discourse sort of stay alive and not having to be reinvented when people discovered that, oh my goodness, the prior one is out of date. There was some utility there. And it's most of the driver for this has just been that the world has been becoming a terrible place. When I read the Strategic Posture Review Commission report in late 2023, at first I was delighted to see such sensible and sound things being adopted by the commissioners on a bipartisan, unanimous basis. And then the second part of me was just deeply depressed because I was trying to imagine what kind of a world it would have to be out there in order to drive those particular people to say those things all together. And it was a pretty grim world. So most of this is just reacting to circumstances. But I always hoped that there was some utility in having more of what I imagine to be a reasonable discourse out there to add some, when I think I recall that, at least in the old days, when the Catholic Church would consider making someone into a saint, there was, as part of the process, traditionally a devil's advocate position, someone whose role in the process was to make the case as to why this was a terrible idea and this person was no saint at all. Not because you necessarily wanted that person to prevail, but because the process lacked integrity and seriousness, unless it would have considered the alternative case, right? So it's like having a defense counsel in a prosecution or something, right? Or a prosecution in a defense, whatever, So having the voice of a countervailing discourse in the room, I thought has an intrinsic value and makes the process more worthwhile. And I was perhaps trying to add a little bit of that devil's advocate piece. And yes, it sucks to say I told you so in so many ways, but I think it needed to be said. And I'm glad that I had bosses that were willing to give me a long enough leash to do some of that.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the disarmament community. So often now it seems to me that when folks refer to arms control, they explicitly mean disarmament. Is there confusion about the two activities? And if so, why do you think?
I think there is some confusion, and to some degree it's understandable because we had a generation after the Berlin Wall fell, for example, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. We had a generation in which they were to some degree synonymous. So arms control agreements were ones that were focused upon reductions. The agenda was how fast and how safely and how quickly can we cut? Can we do it safely and cut as rapidly as we can? Getting ourselves onto that, working our way down that glide slope. And so there was sort of an easy assumption that these things were synonyms and that, of course, arms control was about reducing. But of course, that's not historically true at all. In fact, quite the contrary. Arms control was about managing a really poisonous process of strategic rivalry and not stopping it, but making it as, if you could, channeling it in ways that were perhaps less destabilizing. Or that was the real origins of arms control were in managing a competitive rivalry with no expectation that the weapons were going away at all. In fact, I think the first, if I recall, SALT actually put limits in place on delivery systems that were above where either party was. So it wasn't actually about constraining anything in the immediate term. It was about setting a framework in place that was at least hoped to be, perhaps more manageable and less destabilizing. So I think we forgot that arms control works. Its origins and perhaps its greatest strength is, if you really live in a completely benign environment, maybe you don't need a lot of, that's probably not strictly true, but you need less of the formal challenging agreements because you're sort of going there anyway. That's Moscow, right?
Yeah.
We both announced we were going to go to the Moscow Treaty bans, in effect, before we ever had the treaty, right? So if you're in a happy environment, arms control is a nice to have, not a must have. It's in some sense more important when things are really crappy. But we forgot that. And we assumed that arms control was about disarmament. And now when we're sort of still hoping, there's not a lot of optimism in the short term, but we're still hoping for something in the arms control business. But we need to disabuse ourselves of the idea that it's about disarmament. It is challenging enough to imagine traditional arms control with our current strategic rivals. They have no interest. It's even challenging to think about sort of more sort of transparency and confidence building risk reduction measures. They don't seem to have interest in that either. But if we, as hard as those two things are to think about, were we to come into this with the assumption that arms control is about disarmament, then you're super wasting your time.
Yeah.
This is not that world. And there may be a time when we can have those disarmament-focused discussions again. It just seems silly to waste time and effort on that at the moment.
There seems to be a lack of consensus on the utility of transparency, as you referenced, as a component of arms control, and the function of nuclear signaling today. Do you agree with that? How can the United States clearly signal its intentions in ways that are not destabilizing but threatening, in ways that don't destabilize, as you referred to before, the system, right? Don't have unintended consequences. What's the right balance here or combination?
I'm not sure there is a single right balance. I think we have to be honest enough to recognize there's a tension. In some sense, there's a tension even between risk reduction and deterrence. If you were to be magically 100% successful in reducing nuclear risk, there's no chance of there being a nuclear war, then you couldn't actually use nuclear deterrence, which revolves around deliberately creating at least some degree of risk of nuclear war.
Yeah.
If you really think that there's no way in hell that we will ever use these weapons, you're not going to be remotely deterred by my possessing them. Indeed, it's curious why I would possess them at all, or why you would if they're, So we have to be honest enough to recognize that we are in the business of deliberate risk creation as well as risk mitigation. And where you find that weird Aristotelian point, what is courage, right? It's not recklessness, it's not cowardice, it's some strange spot in the middle. And oh, by the way, maybe it varies depending upon the circumstance. I don't think there's a recipe for this. At least if there is, I don't know it. This is the really hard dangerous, challenging, fraught part of statesmanship. How do we deliberately create enough risk to deter?
Yeah.
But God, please, not too much risk, right? That's the hard part.
Yeah. Are we in the business of risk manipulation then?
We are, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we would probably be better at it if we admitted that we were. It has been a very difficult thing to talk about. And again, I fear this is to some extent a legacy of the benign environment that we assumed ourselves to be indefinitely in after the end of the Cold War, because we sort of forgot. We used to understand these things much more explicitly. I think we sort of forgot that this was the case, or the muscles, the intellectual muscles that we required, that require exercise, or they atrophy. We let them get very flaccid. And
did we forget this was a systemic project?
Yeah, I fear we did. We're relearning this, and it's painful, and we didn't completely forget it, mind you. But this is another reason why I think it has been important for years to have there be a sort of, perhaps a slightly Statler and Waldorf contrarian discourse, at least on the sidelines, because God forbid all this entirely went away. Another reason, by the way, that oral history projects are probably a pretty bloody good idea.
Yeah.
So congratulations on that.
Important to have that historical memory. I want to come back to the NPT for a moment. So at the heart of the NPT is a series of grand bargains, at least two. Is that the right place for that kind of a commitment in this day and age? Is it awkwardly, the commitment to pursue disarmament, is it awkwardly situated within the NPT today?
It is awkwardly, but I mean, I guess it's always been awkwardly. It's not entirely obvious that we could have had the NPT in the form that we did, or and therefore to have presumably it contribute to the successes that it has. That cascade that didn't happen that I referred to earlier. It's not entirely obvious we could have had all of that success without at least some tipping of the hat to disarmament. That was just a political reality of I guess all treaties, as in all legislation, they're sort of like, camels. They're horses that were designed by a committee. Nothing's perfect.
Yeah.
And there might be better ways to approach either one of those goals if you were to try to do them entirely independently. I'm not sure, but it was necessary to do them the way that they were, I suppose. But it is challenging. And I think it is telling. And one of the things that I would always try to remind people of is the degree to which, as I alluded to before, there was an enormous amount of debate in the negotiating of the NPT over these kinds of issues. Repeated efforts to address disarmament questions in this way or that way, or this other provision or that other provision. And we ended up where we are. And I think we probably ended up where we are with the treaty, not for no reason. And it's probably, we are back into a world where the prevailing circumstances the prevailing circumstances of the world today look more like the prevailing circumstances of 1968. Not the same, but more like that than they do the circumstances of, 1995.
Yeah.
So perhaps the awkwardness is, perhaps it even could have been worse. I don't know.
Great, thank you. During your tenure at the State Department, what was your assessment of the risk posed by the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to the NPT regime?
I always believe there's considerable risk. That was, of course, stridently denied by TPNW supporters, although ironically, some of those supporters now are trying to leverage the TPNW against the NPT by saying that, goodness, if you don't make more progress on Article 6, you'll see people defecting to the TPNW. It's precisely what I was warning about. So the protestations that don't worry, there's no tension between them, it was always crap, and people knew it was crap, and they pretended it wasn't. There is a risk. There's a sort of inside baseball wonky risk, and there's sort of a meta risk. The inside baseball wonky risks include things like the TPNW making the additional protocol, adherence to the additional protocol under the NPT IAEA safeguards framework system more challenging because they opted for a harder task. In principle, it's a harder task to essentially put safeguards in around a country that has gotten rid of, that had a big arsenal, knows how to do this, has all the technology, and then says it's now gone. That's in some sense, from a verifier's perspective, a harder task than just verifying non-diversion of peaceful uses in an Article 2 NPT state, right? So for a harder task, the TPNW adopts a more lenient standard, which I think inevitably is going to have probably is having an impact upon making adherence to the additional protocol more challenging to elicit from those who still haven't done it. That's a problem. But the bigger problem is this structural, and that is that there is now essentially a competing instrument for those who want to politically scratch their disarmament itch. They have a way to express that that isn't the NPT. And I do fear there's at least some danger of defections from the one to the other, from the NPT to the TPNW. And then there's the broader also systemic risk that isn't specifically about the NPT, but it's one that I also worry about a great deal. And that is simply the fact that TPNW has been in its operational campaigning so deliberately and openly, overtly targeted at NATO allies and U.S. alliance partners, right? So this is not just, gosh, if anybody happens to believe in disarmament, there's a concerted effort to work in civil society and parliamentary fora and things like this to peel off members of a U.S. nuclear alliance, which, especially this day and age, I think it was always a problem, and it's especially problematic now. Were that to happen, the follow-on effects for strategic stability and deterring the ability of the alliance to deter aggression is hugely important. So this could be of enormously destabilizing impact in either Europe or East Asia.
Even though none of the nuclear weapon states have been lured away.
Well, so far, but many of them continue to have what one diplomat from a NATO ally who will remain nameless described to me as when I was at one point engaging on disarmament issues, the pleas, Chris, you have to help us. Please, we understand what you're saying is right, and our government agrees with you, but we have a parliamentarian problem. The idea that there are countries with parliamentarian problems is a very real thing, and there's a very concerted campaign to work through those circles to peel off, any or all alliance partners. And that is, I would submit, a very dangerous thing from the perspective, at a time in which the other giant nuclear powers, both of them, have moved into predatory mode. Terrible idea, and very, very much in tension with the preservation of deterrence. The NPT, for all of its awkwardness of disarmament, it managed to talk about disarmament in a context that was at least structurally alive to the needs of deterrence. That's not surprising. I mean, this was a text that was co-drafted and introduced by the U.S. and the Soviets working together in the 60s. But there was a strategic wisdom in the NPT that is not remotely present in the TPNW because it wasn't negotiated by people who actually were in a position of serious responsibility for global security outcomes. This was just a piece of ideological performance art designed to express unhappiness about lack of disarmament progress. It is not a serious document done by people with real responsibilities for statesmanship, and it shows. And I fear that could be very pernicious indeed. And that's not even counting the fact that it has a massively asymmetric effect, because civil society campaigns to support disarmament have approximately zero impact in places like Russia and China. They only have impact in countries that in fact rely to a great degree upon nuclear inclusive security arrangements, like the countries of Western Europe or the countries of East Asia. So I see nothing to like in the TPNW. I understand the statement and the expressiveness of the voicing of unhappiness. Sure, that's fine.
Do you understand the frustration?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I freely, and I think for years have freely admitted that there are, I don't pretend that the NPT's de facto division of the world into haves and have-nots is fair. I just contend that it is vastly better than the alternative. It's unfair. It sucks. I wish we didn't have to do it that way. I don't think we have a choice, and the alternative is madness and much, much worse. And I try to remind people of that. Between unfair and a catastrophic geopolitical, nuclear-armed, aggressive shit show, I'll take a bit of unfairness, and I'm sorry, it just has to be that way.
Baked into
I wish
the
I could
system
undo
now.
those things, but you can't undo them at this
That's
point.
right. Yeah. One final question on the NPT. What do you think the future of the treaty should be?
Hard question. I would like it to continue to exist and to continue to have the impact upon at least slowing. I mean, there hasn't been zero proliferation. But But actually, in terms of countries that were in the treaty that are now openly weaponized, there's only one, the North Koreans, after they pulled out. There has been weaponization by those who didn't sign, but that's presumably why they didn't sign, so it's not precisely surprising. Yeah. So I would like to continue to see it do what it does. But it didn't do what it did by itself. It did what it did in a context, right? It did what it was able to do what it did in a situation in which the circumstances were different in ways that I worry about the future by comparison, right? So for most of it, or at least much of its life, you had the major powers deeply committed to nonproliferation. During the Cold War, you had both the Soviets, both Washington and Moscow, committed to nonproliferation for, maybe some self-interested reasons, right? They didn't want other people getting those tools. But from a non-pro perspective, that's great. And they exerted power within their alliance blocks in ways that were very effective. Indeed, it was a simpler task in the Warsaw Pact because they were basically had, Makarov pistols to their head or something. But, in our management of our allies during the Cold War, some of that was very hard and challenging, but ultimately very effective. And I've said for years that, one of the most effective nonproliferation tools that has ever existed is actually the U.S. alliance structure and our security relationships. It is U.S. diplomacy and U.S. security ties that have helped stop nuclear weapons programs in, 5, 6, 7 different countries that probably would otherwise have gone down that route. But, to some degree, that effectiveness depends upon a set of circumstances in the world that, maybe is less true now. I don't know that we have the relative degree of sway that we used to. I don't think the Russians care to, even if they had allies in any meaningful way these days. China is another wild card. They're not, the game is just different now. And so what made it reasonably successful during the Cold War isn't true anymore. What made it reasonably successful during the post-Cold War isn't true anymore either. In the post-Cold War, I think the Russians stopped worrying about it, but the United States as the, hyperpower, the unipole of the system, remained very committed, if anything, even more committed to nonproliferation, right? Again, not for entirely humanitarian reasons. It was very much in our interest that other countries not get nuclear weapons. But, again, you had systemic actors of enormous power in the structure of how the world worked who were committed to nonproliferation. I'm not sure that's as true now. I hope we are still. But it's not clearly so true with the other two major players. And there are now two. This is a three-body problem, and two of them don't seem to particularly care about non-pro. You have a much more, the competitive environment now is one that I think is enough different structurally from where things were either during the post-Cold War era or the Cold War itself that I worry about how effective the NPT can be, or how non-proliferation as a broader, not just the treaty itself. And so this is an extra challenging time, and I would like to see it continue to work its magic, but it's going to be really, really hard.
Thank you. I want to turn to SEND, creating an environment for nuclear disarmament. This was an initiative under your leadership and a significant policy shift of sorts. Could you talk about what SEND consisted of and the intellectual and strategic rationale behind it?
Sure. Actually, in some ways, SEND, at least in my head, was a direct outgrowth of that very process of sort of awkward engagement with the disarmament community that I managed to get permission to do back in the mid-aughts. In particular, it comes out of a conversation that I had with Sergio Duarte, who was a Brazilian diplomat, one of the usual suspects in these fora, who I believe the conversation may have been shortly before he got this job, but he went on to be, and was for a while, was the UN High Commissioner for Disarmament Affairs. Izumi Nakamitsu's job now, for example. And Sergio and I had a conversation at Odyssey at this sort of non-pro conference that gets held there, in which I was giving my little talking points about how we had reduced the size of our arsenal to the smallest since the Eisenhower administration, and why on earth, why didn't we get at least a little credit for having reduced our arsenal by 90%? You would think that would be a good thing, right? They certainly would have, they certainly wanted us to. And Sergio's response, I thought, was enlightening because he explained that, well, those warheads that you guys got rid of, Chris, were ones you didn't need anymore because the Soviet Union collapsed. They were surplus to requirements. So you don't get any credit for getting rid of things you don't need. I'm like, that's interesting. So it isn't actually about disarming. It's about the moral posture. Indeed, his comment suggested to me that we would not, could not, should not be given any credit for getting rid of anything unless we got rid of something that we needed, which is to say only by a performative act of strategic self-harm would the disarmament community be happy with us.
For vulnerability, yeah.
Right? So only if we did something that I would have viewed as like sort of stupid and destabilizing. They deliberately were asking us to do things that I regarded as stupid and destabilizing, as opposed to sort of, I don't know. Anyway, so that got me thinking about like something is deeply, deeply wrong with this discourse. It has shifted from being about outcomes of actually disarming, about having a stabler, peaceful, less competition-riven, more dangerous world. It seems to have shifted from being about making the world less dangerous to just being one of moralistic, performative theatrics. And that just seemed completely absurd to me. And so I began to fret about this in my head doing the NPT job. Like, is there a way to reframe discourse on disarmament issues in a way that made more sense and that actually seemed to be consonant with the aspirations I would like to think that we all have to, in fact, live in a less dangerous world, not in necessarily a morally, performatively idyllic world, but just a less dangerous world. And I think in some ways that was the intellectual seed. I guess I don't know that Sergio would be happy that I give him credit for Send, but in some way it was reacting to what I felt was the absurdity of his position that got those juices flowing. And so when I got to the NSC in 2017, we did a little internal scrub, basically an after-action report on the Prague agenda, at least as I viewed this, which itself was the sort of institutional core of Send, because the conclusions we reached in that internal review were basically revolved around the idea that we badly needed a reframing of discourse. And our conclusions were that the Obama agenda had sort of run its course. It had not worked. It had been a combination of creating unrealistic expectations in the disarmament community, which then were, of course, inevitably thwarted, leading to bitterness and counter-reaction in the form of the humanitarian impact movement and the TPNW, but also not well received, if anything, counterproductively received by the folks we worried about most. Right? Our would-be adversaries did not regard the Prague agenda as a good thing at all. They regarded this as a sort of there's a trick here, they felt, right? This was an American ploy to, and even the Russians and the Chinese seemed to have thought it was sort of a ploy to get them to, to encourage them to get rid of their nuclear weapons so that we could continue to push them around with our conventional might, which at the time still seemed like a thing. Not anymore. So I didn't think we got much out of this whole thing. And I thought, what can we do better? And so Send was an effort to figure out what we can do better. And in some sense, this goes back to my earlier comment, by the way, in some sense, I think the strategic wisdom that was embedded in the NPT all along, because of its birth in a time of competitive rivalry and deep involvement by the competitive rivals in its crafting, I think there's some wisdom encoded in it that we could and hopefully still can learn from. And in some sense, the inspiration for Send was tied back into looking at the preamble of the NPT, where it is said in the bits of the preamble that talk about disarmament, it speaks really eloquently about the importance of easing tension and strengthening trust between nations in order to facilitate disarmament, basically, right? Yeah. So that causal arrow was really important to me. So easing tensions is how you get to disarmament. Whereas it struck me that the disarmament community had gotten that entirely backward. The cart had been put before the horse. The imagining was that if you make the weapons go away, then the world will be a safer place. Like, the weapons, in my view, were the symptom, not the disease. And if you were to make this a real answer, you would need to address the underlying circumstances of that tension and distrust. So the NPT has been telling us what we needed to know all along. And Send was an effort to try to focus diplomatic discourse upon, well, let's talk about how to ease tensions and strengthen trust, as the NPT asks us to do in order to facilitate disarmament. without any expectation that we necessarily have a magic recipe for getting there. I don't know. I don't know what the way to do that is. But if we're not talking about that as the objective, then we really aren't talking about anything meaningful or useful at all. And so SEND was an effort to focus upon security circumstances and the challenges that drive countries to wish to get nuclear weapons, that drive countries to not want to get rid of all their nuclear weapons. And, let's have a conversation about what, if anything, can be done to address those issues. Because if you can't do that, you really are just wasting time.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about this lately, how, let's call them the two sides, are both essentially worried about nuclear risk, right? But those who think that we're not in a moment where we can focus on arms control are worried about risks from within the system as they understand it. And those who are worried about nuclear accidents, the possibility of misperception, are worried about risks to the system, right? From the symptom, essentially, as you described it. And it's striking that after so many decades, there just remain these two very distinct frameworks for not just perceiving, but really feeling nuclear risk, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that actually sort of stereotypical sort of hawks are actually feel nuclear risks more. They feel more risks, right? I mean, the disarmament community tends to focus upon solely the risk of nuclear holocaust, and everything else needs to be sacrificed on that altar. And if on one level, that's not crazy. If you really thought it were super likely, A, and B, it was like species-wise existential, okay, you can make a case for that, I suppose. But I think the hawks, not that they don't feel that risk, they are acutely aware of that risk. They also feel other risks too. They fear the risk of great power aggression. Allies of the United States feel risks too. They fear risk. They fear risks of geopolitical predation, right? So there may be a broader envelope of risks that one is trying to work against, but it doesn't exclude the risk of Holocaust. My goodness, it's explicitly part of that. The challenge is to do that at the same time as deterring aggression, and which is a harder task, to be sure, intellectually and practically. And there isn't. I don't think in any of these areas there's not a magic recipe for making it happen. One of the things I've tried to, as a scholar, to draw attention to is the degree to which I think the disarmament community needs to be more focused on some of these additional risks as well, including the risks that their own agenda might perhaps create. This is something that I've written on a little bit, in the sense that I am not at all convinced that abolition is game theoretically stable in a world in which people really do know. We've had, I used to be an intelligence officer in the Navy, and there's a thing called a fact of compromise. It's not the details of the information that is released, but it's the fact that it can be done at all, right? So the fact of compromise for nuclear weaponry has, that occurred in the 30s. People have known for a long time that it's possible to do a nuclear chain reaction that under certain circumstances could be massively explosive. As long as you've had that fact of compromise, and people, if people had never thought of this, perhaps you'd have a stable world at zero. But in a technologically sophisticated world in which, goodness gracious, we all know how to generate power from nuclear fission. People have technology. People know where the materials are. This is a known thing. I mean, my goodness, we built the first bomb, and God help us, we used the first bomb that had never been tested. It was made in the age of a slide rule. These are not that hard to do, at least crudely. I don't know how you undo that, but let's assume you get to zero. I'm not sure zero is game theoretically stable, because the first major crisis between any reasonably technologically sophisticated powers is, in some sense, as Tom Schelling once observed, a nuclear crisis, because I fear that even an abolition environment would generate reconstitution races. And by the way, if you and I are both reconstituting, desperately trying to get a weapon because we are already in a crisis, it's not just a race to reconstitute, it's a race to use. Because if I get there first and you're about to, I've screwed my hemispheres together into a bomb before you do, and you're about to, I have a strong incentive to use them on you, to preclude you having that tool against me. So I don't know that we really have a lot of options here. And I don't know that the disarmament community has ever really thought through the geopolitics of the world that they're trying to to create.
That is the extreme case, right? Total disarmament. But there are those who would say, you just said the United States needs more nuclear weapons now. There are those who would say, we have plenty, right? So not quite that we need to disarm to this destabilizing zero, but what we have is enough to hold the system at stability.
That depends upon a number of assumptions, which might or might not be true, and I do worry about them. I'm not of the view that we need to go 1-for-1 with two adversaries at the same time. A, that doesn't seem technically feasible. And B, I don't know that there's any clear deterrence logic case for it. I mean, you need enough to be able to do several things. You need enough somehow to be able to threaten, for deterrence purposes, to threaten something the adversary holds dear enough that the kind of aggression you fear he will find unattractive. That's one task. There are tasks. You need enough, or a posture, not in terms of numbers necessarily, but a posture of types of things that are sufficient to help you handle coercive bargaining challenges, right? So this is where I fear one of the ways in which I think we do need to be going up. There is, even if leaving aside the issue of how many core strategic forces we need, I think that in some sense the gravest need right now is to redress a significant imbalance in sub-strategic weapons, theater class things and this kind of thing, which enable a great power adversary to create escalation dilemmas. If the Russians are particularly adapted at this because they love nuclear coercive bargaining, and they have built a force posture with lots of shorter range, smaller things too. Sort of they have a Swiss Army arsenal, a nuke for every circumstance. Oh, that needs a screwdriver. No, that needs a can opener. No, that's a corkscrew, right? They have lots of tools, which has the potential to create some very challenging dilemmas for us in the event of limited use in a coercive bargaining context, because we then would have the very, very awkward problem of not responding in a nuclear way at all, or jumping straight up to full scale, Tridents and Minutemen kind of thing, which it's not a great dilemma to be in. So I think there's a strong case to be made for having more in the sort of intermediate category. So that's not a question of numbers per se. It's a question of what it is that you have numbers of. So that's a challenge as well. And then there's the additional problem, which we've struggled with for many years of the Cold War. If deterrence does fail, what do you do? And the assumption has been in U.S. planning for a long time that, God forbid, deterrence fails, there is a logic that would make it very useful to be able to engage in some degree of damage limitation targeting. And that's a separate question from deterrence, right? I think we are probably deterred by a very minimalist. I mean, I think, any conceivable American president probably would be pretty successfully deterred by threats to a small number of U.S. population centers. Yeah. We're not a hard deter-y, if that makes any sense, in that regard. But that doesn't mean that if deterrence fails, an adversary wouldn't necessarily want to have some damage limitation capability, because if things are going to start flying, each side has some incentive to make sure that as few of those things fly their direction as possible. And there's no good answer in that world. It's a horrible, horrible world. But there are better and worse, or maybe not better. There are worse answers and even more worse answers. How about that? And so damage limitation is a third piece. So you've got the basic deterrence, you've got the escalation coercive bargaining management challenges, and you've got the damage limitation challenge. And so the challenge of force posture is like, what do you build and how many do you have of what that let you adequately do all three of those things? And being able to do those things relies upon a number of assumptions. Especially the first is interesting because we don't know for a fact what deters who exactly what. I mean, if you want to threaten what the adversary holds most dear, you need to have a reasonably confident idea of what it is that he holds most dear. Maybe we think we do. It's not a given. If we had 100% confidence that Putin and Xi would be deterrable by a small number of population strikes in the same way that I think a U.S. president would, you could make an argument for even a smaller core strategic arsenal, maybe. But if you're not certain of that, what buffer do you build around the uncertainties in your assessment of the adversary's motivational structure? And oh, by the way, if you're talking about core deterrence, that motivational structure may be different in 10 years' time when it's no longer Xi or Putin or whatever, right? So this is the crazy alchemy of how do you think about doing this. And we have for many years opted for a large and flexible arsenal because we don't know all those answers. And that seems the least imprudent way to posture against the range of uncertainties that we face. It's not a great answer, but I don't know that there's a better one available.
It's a constant recalculation, isn't it?
Indeed.
Do you think Russia is bullying or coercing the United States into increased nuclear spending?
A cost imposition strategy, they're playing the game back on us that we did with them in the 80s. Maybe, although they're certainly spending quite a bit themselves with a much more challenged, more interesting question about Beijing than the Russians, I suppose. The Chinese, perhaps, that could be part of their thinking. I don't think it's much of my instinct is it's not much of the Russian thinking in the sense that we could probably still have a spending race with the Russian Federation at this point, and it would not go well for Putin. Xi Jinping, it's a different question. I don't know. And even then, knowing that the adversary is pushing you into a cost imposition strategy isn't necessary. It doesn't invariably follow from that you shouldn't engage, because they may still be doing things that are sufficiently threatening that having no response to them, even if it saved you a bunch of money, might still be worse than squandering that money. So these are, these things are always in tension. Policymaking is about choosing between crappy answers, and we shouldn't pretend that there's necessarily going to be a great answer to any of these problems. But.
Thank you. Just to come back to SEND for a minute, did the process yield any concrete outcomes or shifts in the discourse that you found particularly notable or that you hoped you would accomplish?
I don't know, because SEND ran for 4 years in the Biden administration. I think the people who've done this, by the way, at the State Department have now been fired by the second Trump administration. So if SEND continues, it's going to have to be somebody else out there in the rest of the world stepping up and taking over that role. And I hope that someone is willing to do that and that they do it well. But for 4 years it ran, and I didn't have any contact with it. So I don't know how much we were able to change the discourse. By the time I left, it had only been going for a couple of years. We stood it up, I think, in maybe late 2018. So by the time I left at the beginning of 2021, also there was COVID, by the way. So the in-person meetings stopped happening for a bit, right? So I don't know how much it changed discourse. We had a pretty good uptake. There were 40-something countries that came to this pretty consistently, and they were a range of countries that were from across the spectrum. There were nuclear weapons possessors, and there was TPNW states. There were, people from the global south, people from the developed north. There were people from, different regions of the world, including on the opposite side of some really nasty schisms in those regions of the world. So it was a remarkably diverse group of people bringing a whole bunch of perspectives to this. So it was very optimistic in terms of people. They seemed like they wanted to talk about these things. And that, at least impliedly, there is an acknowledgement that, no one said this because, I might have said such a thing because I'm that kind of a guy, but I think most of these diplomats were not going to come into this and say, gosh, we're glad we're having this conversation because the previous discourse was stilted and sterile and worthless. No one's going to say that.
Right.
But it sort of felt like, yeah, precisely right. I'm not always a diplomat, even though I'm a diplomacy, but it did feel like there was a real degree of relief and interest in having these conversations. Now, whether the conversations, in retrospect, feel like they were once worth having, I don't know. I like to think that having those discussions about security circumstances and how they might how to think about their alleviation, or at least how to manage them with disarmament as a, eventual hoped for perhaps thing in mind. I like to think that having that discourse bubbling as the world has continued its deteriorating slide over the last, 8 years, that's probably a good thing, because as we try to teach ourselves how to deal with a challenging and competitive security environment, maybe those are muscles that weren't quite as relaxed and sad and floppy as they otherwise would have been had there not been some discussion of this right now. I'm not sure. I hope that there is value, but it's hard for me to assess from the outside. Yeah,
fair. Chris, I want to turn to New START extension, strategic arms control, and a potential future agreement. How, during your tenure, did the Trump administration approach the question of involving China in strategic arms control? You alluded to a trilateral framework. Could you talk about that?
Sure. Well, it was pretty clear at that point that this is actually, interestingly, before news broke about all this remarkably huge new silo fields out in Xinjiang. So this was even before China. I mean, we knew they were building up, but it was more of a gradual build at that point. They had not yet, to our knowledge, at least I don't recall seeing anything on this. I'm sure I would have remembered it. I don't think we knew at that point about this like massive increase in their ICBM numbers. But it was clear that China was building, and we had it wasn't as acute as we now know it to be, but the feeling was there was indeed a three-body problem coming up, and there weren't a lot of conceptual models for how to do that in arms control. We'd become very accustomed to bilateral engagements, and so we were thinking that, oh gosh, it's time to start to do the intellectual spade work to figure out what a three-party negotiation might need to look like, and what kind of an agreement might even be possible. So there's this idea of how do you have an approach to three-body negotiation to begin with, and there's a broader question of what kind of a limit would actually make sense, and a limited, what kind of approaches would make sense. One of the things we spent a fair amount of time staring at things like the Washington Naval Treaty, which is like one of the few historical precedents I can think of where there was actually a numerical differentiation between multiple parties in an agreement. But by the way, it wasn't just fixing different levels. It was a package of agreements in 1922 that were agreed, including what you might call sort of political arms control, where there's sort of an agreement as to who has, impliedly at least, who has primacy in what areas of the world. There was a lot of really interesting stuff actually in the Washington Naval precedent. So we were looking at those kind of stuff. We were looking at issues of again, trying to do the conceptual spade work for, were there historical lessons or game theoretical ideas or anything we could draw upon that would provide some kind of a way forward for a three-party engagement, and again, not on the assumption that we could come up with this brilliant answer and then like foist it on the other two, right? This would have, if there were to be any discussion, this would have to be worked out between us. But we needed to, do some work and to bring ideas to the table. I recall going through a list with a Russian counterpart who was Ryabkov, I guess, at one point. A list of sort of questions or historical ideas, things to draw upon without advocating anything, to try to get conversations going about even what kind of conceptual terrain we were talking about. We ended up focusing by late 19, early 2020 on the idea of a cap on warhead numbers, not necessarily as a final solution, but at least as a stopgap, right? Can we pause this, as it were? I hate to say freeze, right? Because I have bad memories of the nuclear freeze debates from back in the day. So that wasn't the conceptual model at all. But, freeze is as good a phrase as any. Can we not freeze them permanently necessarily, but can you just sort of stop, push the pause button long enough to have conversations about what should come?
And this would be a total warhead?
That was a concept, in some fashion, right? Could we have an overall cap? Marshall Billingsley came in what was the date? I can't recall. Early 2020 sometime, to be the sort of special envoy for this kind of thing, and then took up the baton of running around trying to get Russians and Chinese together on this. But we had begun thinking about what that might look like without a lot of answers. But big challenge, of course, is China was at much lower numbers at the time. They still are, for the moment, at least. They're fixing that, I guess. Gosh, but they were at much lower numbers, and so having the Russians and the Americans at X, and then the Chinese at some other smaller number, clearly might be problematic from their perspective over the long term. But at the very least, we were hoping to have that kind of a pause so that we can get together and have a meaningful interval in which to try to come up with better answers over time. Didn't end up working, but that was the approach. The idea of a cap on warhead numbers was challenging because no one had ever, really done that before, right? The focus is always on delivery systems. There are observables and verification ideas that were pretty well established by this point when it came to things like missiles. Missiles in subs, missiles on the ground. What you do with bombers. Warheads are, small, hard to see, more sensitive. How do you verify? A warhead cap was going to be one of the really big challenges, and we had a lot of work done on that actually. And there were some interesting concepts. I don't know, we didn't get the chance to play them out much because there wasn't any interest on their side. But
from the national labs,
including, the concept that I liked the most intellectually was the idea of a sort of, clearly we weren't going to be able to no one was going to accept the verification regime that was sufficient to find an object, like this big, hidden in a barrel in somebody's basement, someplace in the size, in a big country. That was ridiculous, right? The concept that I liked the most was actually we didn't have a good concept for it. I thought a good term for it, but I think it is sort of a net zero approach. That all sounds very like climate sciencey and like the debates on net zero in Britain. Nothing to do with that. It had to do with so let's just
perimeters.
Stop the number. Oh. Whatever number you have right now, let's just say we're not going to, we're going to freeze this for the moment, cap it for the moment, pending whatever, final solution that you can come up with perhaps. But how do you verify that you're not, the point would not to be be able to tell with great fidelity how many you have, because I freely admit that I'm never going to, if you want to hide one, I probably can never, ever find it. The point would just be to make sure that you're not adding to it, right? So if perhaps you have some kind of a verification ring fence around production facilities, some way of verifying that something that comes out is or is not a warhead, and therefore if a warhead comes out, you have to bring something in that is identifiable as a warhead so that you end up with a net zero in the deployed world. Were there technical ways to do that? It was conceivable, still really hard, but that was the kind of thing we were working on as a verification concept. I remember explaining it once to Anatoly Antonov, the ambassador to the United States, having lunch at his residence, where we're sort of sitting at this table in this room, being served by his staff, and so I gave the example of bread rolls. I don't know how many bread rolls you have in your pocket. You may have brought in a pile of bread rolls. I don't know, right? I've got this bread roll here. You can see this, but I might have brought bread rolls too, right? We don't know the number of bread rolls, but we can, in principle, set up a system that keeps us at whatever number of bread rolls we came in with, right? So as long as we search your guy when he comes in or leaves the room, we know that there's a no net change. And leaving is actually fine. If he wants to bring a bread roll out, that's probably fine. But right, these are a conceptual framework whereby you can not know the absolute number, but can perhaps have reasonable confidence that it's not increasing. And that's not a crazy idea. And technically, that's hard. And ask the technical people, right? The verifying in a reliable way what is or is not a warhead, getting agreed upon standards of how to have confidence in that. These are not simple questions by any means, but they're not impossible things.
No, and as satellite imagery improves over time, I would imagine.
But to a degree, but still, overhead imagery take one of what old General Lebed's so-called suitcase nukes, right? I don't know what overhead gets you for that. That would have been a hard challenge, but we were working on those kinds of things as a way to think about how we might perhaps be able to verify an overall cap. But it never got to that point because, as Marshall rather painfully discovered, the Chinese weren't remotely interested in having any of these discussions. And the Biden administration then segued from that, and we were talking about more traditional limits. Not really traditional limits, but more traditional limits. The Biden administration segued to let's just talk about risk reduction and transparency, confidence building, things like this. And they got the same answer that Marshall had. So we all did try.
And then they went with the New START extension immediately. Right. Was that the best option on the table at that moment?
Personally, I would have gone for and advocated, not that anybody took me up on it, but I think we had the option, if I recall correctly, the lawyers did not preclude this, not necessarily going all 5 years at once. I thought if we wanted to use this for negotiating leverage, we'd give them a year, all right, because at that point, they seemed like they wanted us to do the extension. So fine, we'll do an extension for a year, but that gives us a year to talk. And if, maybe if it's promising, we'll do another year. So you get 5 bites at the apple or 4 bites at the apple. I would have dribbled it out year by year, but still I was in favor of extension to a degree at the time.
And so is the question, did the structure of the treaty permit that, or?
I think it did. It just didn't preclude it. It said you can extend it up to 5 years. All right, we'll extend it up to 1 year. Then we'll extend it up to another year. Maybe you can't get more than 5 out of it, but I would have tried to salami slice it a little bit, but for negotiating purposes. But the Biden administration wanted to virtue signal that they were pro-arms control, and we were not those Trump people, so they just went for the whole thing and lost whatever leverage they had with the Russians. But
arguably made allies very happy.
Yeah, probably did. Yeah, that's true. Yes, it would have been a nerve-wracking thing to dribble it out like I was imagining. We would have had some ally anxiety there for sure. But 5 years in this stuff for things that take multi-decade programs of record to build, 5 years is not a long time, and so this is all.
There's a lot of sunk cost in these treaties.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
want to ask you some big picture questions. You've been an advocate for what you call reality-based arms control. What does that mean to you today?
I think it means being honest enough to admit that the realm of the possible isn't always very great. Sometimes there may not be anything that's possible. I'm now, for the last couple of years, have been saying that I think, while very much an advocate for using arms control to support security and stability, I fear that the only way back to the kind of arms control that I would like to see in that respect, really any arms control, may have to run through a fraught period of counterpoised posturing. I don't, this goes back to the Euro missiles analogy, which maybe I learned too much from back when I was a kid, but I don't know that our adversaries in this game have any particular interest or incentive to sit down and talk to us. They think they're doing fine, building and posturing in the way that they are. They feel they have coercive bargaining advantages. I suspect they feel they have long-term production advantages at the moment still, by virtue of the structure of their nuclear infrastructures. We are behind where we need to be and only starting to fix things in the U.S. weapons infrastructure. I fear that we've sent the signal to the adversaries that they have some ability to compete with us in a long-term arms race because we simply can't build very fast. And so we've set things up, ironically, by being too trusting, I suppose, during this sort of happy, benign period of the post-Cold War era. And they don't feel incentive to sit down and have meaningful talks with us about restraint. Well, I think we can change that, and we're starting to do things that I hope will have that effect. But to get to the place where they have an incentive to have a meaningful conversation with us about negotiated restraints, I fear means that we're going to have to do some, we're going to have to go to the gym and swig a lot of protein powder and, find a martial arts master for a while before they take us seriously in these talks. So I fear that we're sort of in the 1979 to 1983 phase of having to get back in the business of giving them real reasons to care whether they're in an arms race with us. I want them to think that being in an arms race with us is a terrible idea, because it is. And it's a terrible idea in the broader sense, but I want them to feel a very concrete way in which it is a terrible idea so that we can sit down and have a conversation about how to not be in one. But I don't think they feel that yet. And I think it is our job now to make them feel that once again. That's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty. And our allies are going to be very anxious. And the disarmament community is going to be very, very desperately unhappy. But I think the only way forward to productive arms control at this point is probably something like that.
Yeah.
It's depressing, but I fear reality.
That's
reality-based arms control. Right.
And then LRSO is due to be deployed in the next several years, SLCMN 2035, all along the way.
Hopefully they can speed that one up. But,
hopefully. All along the way, fruits of the modernization process will come due. Do you think the net effect of the emergence, let's say, of all of these new capabilities will be that lever?
I hope so. Modernization per se, right? To some degree, the program of record is treading water, right? It's designed to keep antique systems from just aging out. So it's absolutely essential. This is where the Strategic Posture Review Commission had it absolutely right? So it is, absolutely essential, but not sufficient. I think in terms of the counterpoise capability to get the adversaries to think harder about coming back to a conversation about restraint with us, I think that may require more than just the program of record, because the program of record in principle will just keep an Ohio class analog in play, a Minuteman III class analog in play, right?
With some modernization, right? Some improvements.
Some improvements, yeah. I don't know that is enough to really change the strategic calculus from their perspective. More interesting will be things like SLCMN, and more interesting still would be if we can be creative in some other stuff. I tend to be forward-leaning on thinking about what we can try to do creatively with new sub-strategic capabilities that perhaps would get their attention and refocus them upon the idea that this isn't perhaps a great path for us all to be on. We'll see. I think there is. I think that there is some interesting exploration of options. We're all waiting to see what the second Trump administration's nuclear posture review, or whatever analog to that they end up producing, will say. Nobody knows what the answer is there yet. Yeah. I do understand there's some very creative thinking underway to provide the powers that be inside the system with a, what I think of sort of a Chinese menu of options. What will be chosen, why it will be chosen, what they will do with it, that's all still to be determined. But this is, I think, very much an inflection point, and it's our challenge to make of it something useful. We'll see.
It's been said that the administration doesn't plan to engage in the process to produce a nuclear posture review. Are you suggesting there are other processes in place? What do you anticipate?
Whether they have an exact, a specific nuclear posture review is one question. That's, is there a specific document that lays things out in that kind of a way? That's, I think, I sort of like the idea, because I'd like having there be a one-stop shop articulation of nuclear policy, nuclear weapons policy. But it's, you could embed the same information and the same choices into the national defense strategy or into other various things. I mean, in some sense, it doesn't matter hugely. The bigger question is what you're actually choosing to do.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really waiting to see. I mean, if they have an NPR light or some other thing, I don't feel hugely strongly
executive order, perhaps?
I mean, I like there being an authoritative text rather than just having someone go out and give a speech.
A tweet.
Right.
Yeah, example.
But, I'm reasonably easygoing on what kind of authoritative text they would use. I just very much like the idea of having there be an authoritative articulation of not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it, right? Yeah. Because, I suppose if all you were going to do is continue the program of record for all the reasons you had a program of record, I suppose you wouldn't need to explain that very much. But if we are going to be doing anything new and interesting, it is, I think, especially important that we articulate why and make that case on the record in public for the American people, for our allies, for our adversaries, for the record. There's a lot to be said for articulating this well and clearly and in a thoughtful way that puts the case, in print. Specifically how they do that, I hope they find a good way. That's less important than I think the imperative that they do that.
Yeah.
At an inflection point where we are now again in the up business, as I was saying before, being able to make that case publicly from a sitting government is really, really important.
Great, thank you. From your experience negotiating arms control, broadly speaking, what is the biggest lesson you've learned, or an occasion in which you've been able to overcome a negotiation obstacle?
I haven't done a lot of arms control negotiating, mind you. My negotiating tends to have been things like squabbling over resolutions at the IAEA Board of Governors or whatever it is. So I don't know that I can point to a specific example of something, of an obstacle overcome. I would encourage negotiators, people approaching these issues or studying these issues, who just care about these issues, to have as much historical literacy on this as they can. It's not that one can necessarily get crisp templates from the past that can be applied to the future. That's never quite true, right? Doesn't repeat itself, but it might rhyme, as the old joke goes, right? But having that context, I think it was enormously helpful to me to be able to, just an example, debating issues around disarmament in Article 6 and so forth, being able to actually be familiar with and to be able to reference and to be aware of how the negotiating dynamics of the treaty actually went in coming up with Article 6. Why is the treaty structured the way it did? What were the debates? How was this explained at the time? What was tried but rejected? That background is critical to understanding what the treaty means. And having a little bit of, the ability to have an intelligent conversation on the arcana of how the treaty got to be the way that it was is really important to being an effective I would argue, to being an effective diplomat in this way, because it gives you a context and a repertoire of things of examples to draw upon. It gives you the ability to some extent to throw down the BS card where you need to. The claims were made about X, Y, and Z being true. I said, well, actually, quite the contrary. And I would refer you to the debates they had in May of 1967 about this, when it was so and so introduced the resolution to do this other thing, and it was shot down. So clearly, what you're suggesting, someone wanted to do that, but that was not what the treaty said. Being able to have that context and that repertoire of background knowledge is, I think, really, really important. And it's especially important for folks in our system because though the career bureaucrats probably have a lot of this knowledge, the folks who end up in the fancy seats often come in from all kinds of random points of the compass, and they need to do their homework to make sure, because they're going to be up against folks who know this stuff extremely well, and will be spinning that background knowledge for their own purposes. And have some yourself, because you're going to need to play on that terrain, and otherwise they'll push you around.
Great, thank you. Looking back on your career in government and arms control thus far, what are you most proud of?
Goodness. In some ways, the things I'm most proud of, I would say, are more along the lines of feeding into our refocusing of U.S. national security strategy and foreign policy upon great power competition, and the ways in which we ended up doing that. Specifically in this area, though, I am quite proud of CENT. I can't point to it as having revolutionized everything or had enormous earth-shattering results yet, although I hope it has had some, hopefully some more modest catalytic ones. But the idea of trying to take a generations-long discourse, intellectual discourse, and reframe it in ways that are more constructive. Maybe it's just the sort of the scholar in me that finds, the possibility of being able to contribute to doing something like that as a genuine thought leader, not just a sort of mover of wheels and gears and a occupier of a seat for a while, or sort of just keeping the policy machine ticking over, but actually really trying to change how people think about important and world historically significant issues. If I can have done that to some degree, I'd be pretty jazzed by that.
That's great. Thank you. Is there a moment, whether in a negotiation room, behind the scenes, that particularly sticks with you as emblematic of the challenges of arms control?
Okay. In observing the distinction between arms control and disarmament, I mean, my temptation would be that sort of seminal conversation with Sergio Duarte, where I had oh my goodness, they're actually playing a different game than I thought they were moment that led me to try to reconceptualize what disarmament discourse should look like. That's one key moment, but that's not really an arms control moment.
It's fair. I'll take it.
I guess it'll have to do.
Has your perspective on the role of diplomacy evolved over the course of your career?
I'm not sure it has. I don't think I came into the diplomatic world with any of the... Indeed, I came in sort of, to some degree, in fisticuffs with such assumptions. But I've struggled for a long time in my career against the assumption that there's something... And I alluded to this before, but something magical about diplomatic engagement that is both capable of overcoming any obstacles as long as you work at it hard enough with enough good faith and earnestness, and that there is intrinsic value in it, in the sense that these are things that are valuable for their own sake. I don't know that I would agree with either of those propositions, and I've struggled against them to some degree. There can be enormous value. I'm closer to the view that there is intrinsic value in trying to engage, but I think that's a little bit different than actually engaging, because there are circumstances in which you clearly don't have a good faith interlocutor, or what they are trying to do in their engagement is something that you simply can't allow to move forward, or need to try to resist in some way. So I've been fairly self-consciously trying to be in the disillusioned people of naive faith in agreements and treaties and diplomacy, while maintaining what I hope and think is a realistic hope for them and faith in them to a degree. Yeah. Moderating naive expectations with a dose of somewhat slightly cynical reality has been something of what I've been trying to do. And
Your brand.
There's a tension, right? I mean, I remember having a conversation with John Bolton once and about the, it's a slightly different context, but it perhaps illustrates a bit of the flavor of this tension, right? So in the non-proliferation business, let's say we discover, this is a worry that Hawks always had about the diplomatic process in the non-pro world, right? So the stereotype from a conservative perspective is that, let's say you discover that country X is shipping missile parts to a terrible rogue regime. The diplomatic instinct will be to go to demarche them, right? What John Bolton used to call demarshmallows. You sort of, issue a diplomatic protest. Hey, we found out that this terrible transfer of dangerous technology is happening. Really terrible idea. I assume you didn't know about this, but it's really important and it's in your jurisdiction, so please stop it. 6 months later, you get your intelligence reporting, and I forgot the crucial bit, right? So then the interlocutor says, oh, by the way, that sounds very troubling. We would certainly look into this. Tell me more about what you know, because we have to be able to identify, where this is moving and how it's happening. So then we declassify and give them a bunch of information about what we think is going on. They take this, thank you very much, we'll look into it. 6 months later, your intelligence report comes back and says, hey, we don't have any more information that this is happening. The diplomat says, look, we solved the problem. And the cynic says, no, they just killed your source because you were foolish enough to tell them too much about what you know, right? So there is a, has that happened? Probably. Did it happen all the time? Probably not, right? So I don't want to, Hawks assume this happened all the time. Doves assume that we absolutely needed to engage with everyone and work in good faith to solve these problems. I always like to think that I was in the business of trying to encourage a bit of expectations moderation here, and adding a bit of realism to counteract maybe instincts of naivety in faith in the diplomatic process to solve all problems, while still being able and willing to use that process, because it can do lots of things. You just have to be, a little bit hard-bitten about it, I would argue. But.
Along those lines, was there ever an occasion where you were sort of pleasantly surprised about something you were able to learn in the course of engaging diplomatically?
I was really excited to see, I had the good fortune to be not centrally involved, but involved to a degree in this whole process by which we got rid of Muammar Gaddafi's weapons of mass destruction. I was not involved in the secret, super squirrely negotiations that went on between NSC and CIA with British counterparts and the Libyans up to December of 2003 behind the scenes. But once Gaddafi officially pledged to get rid of his weapons of mass destruction program, the bureau for which I worked at the State Department took over as the sort of interagency coordinator for the teams and the process by which we actually, cooperatively got rid of his programs in country. So I spent about a week in Libya as part of that stuff. There's a much larger effort there. I was only a piece of it. But I went along with Bob Joseph, who was at the time he was the NSC senior director, who was sort of leading who had led the secret negotiations for the White House, and a guy named Steve Kappas, who was at the CIA at the time. For the conclusion of the negotiations with the Libyans on how this is going to move forward, I went along because we had already been identified as the State Department as taking over the process of doing the dismantlement. So I was kind of the connective tissue, the transition figure between the secret NSC CIA piece and the overt state stuff. But I went along with Bob and Steve to London to meet with the Brits and talk with the Libyans. It's a fellow named Musa Kusa, I believe, who was Gaddafi's head of intelligence, a deeply sinister man, looks like a Bond villain, sounds like a Bond villain, and I don't even want to think about all the horrific things he must have done as the head of the Libyan intelligence service. But Musa Kusa was our interlocutor, and I was there. I was basically along for I was a very quiet participant. These were more senior people than me doing the work. But Joseph and Kappas were closing out the arrangements with Musa Kusa about how we would then proceed to go send teams into Libya to help work with them to get rid of this stuff. And then I also, after that, went with John Bolton to Vienna to talk with Mohammed El-Baradei to work out our protocols for working with the IAEA on how this would work. So I was able to be any very minor way part of, but certainly present for, actual negotiations accomplishing concrete things to make a weapons of mass destruction program go away. It wasn't a hugely advanced program, thank God, but it was, it was real, and they had real stuff.
Yeah.
And my goodness, they even had Chinese nuclear weapons designs that A.Q. Khan had given to Muammar Gaddafi, strangely enough, in a Karachi dry cleaner shopping bag, as I recall. But a weird instance of huge non-pro success, like one of the few sort of rollbacks that I can think of. And there was a powerful diplomatic piece that helped make this possible. And I had the great good fortune to be able to sort of watch it happening in front of my two little eyeballs, it was super cool. And there was enormously good work done by Bob and Steve and the rest of the folks who put this together. And we at State were delighted and honored to be able to pick it up and make Gaddafi's program go away.
Yeah.
It was amazing. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you. Outside your official work, are there books, thinkers, or experience that have shaped your approach to policy and strategy?
I like to think that everything I come across, I don't know, shapes it somehow. In addition to sort of urging people in the field to do their historical homework and have some background knowledge and a repertoire of examples and illustrations to pull upon, I suspect I should also encourage really just wide engagement with the broader policy and history and politics world. All these things are embedded in context, and maybe this goes back to my. Maybe in a weird way, it goes back to that little insight that has been so important, I think, to send from the NPT preamble that if you want to get to disarmament, you need to move somehow through easing tensions and strengthening trust. That all these issues that specialists in the field probably have an instinct to assume is, the critical things you need to know are about weapons and back in the old days, it was like, what's the throw weight? How many RVs could it handle? There's a lot of detailed specialist knowledge that is incredibly important. But I guess I would encourage people to be really broadly engaged with the bigger human community, because just as you can only get to solving those very technical arms type problems by moving through a lot of bigger picture issues of trust and distrust and tension and lack of tension in the world. All these things are embedded in the broader sort of human contexts of decision makers who are making decisions, people who are funding things, populations that either support or don't support particular policy agenda items, how these things are played by values and norms and political entrepreneurs over time as you look back at things. These are much, much bigger, complex adaptive systems of challenges. And I think having that breadth of engagement with the broader world of how people engage with each other at scale is really critical context and will make you a much better diplomat and negotiator. This is not you need to have detailed, serious, specialized knowledge. But if that's all you have, I think that's also a failing.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Final question. If you could go back and give your younger self one piece of professional advice, what would it be?
Wow, that's a hard question. I wish I did some, but I wish I had done more. Maybe back up. I'm a big fan of trying to put the whys and wherefores, what I think of as the why stories, out and on the record as much as possible at any stage, right? It's not just sort of what you're doing. Any policymaker will need to articulate what the policy is. Okay, we're going to be doing this. Here's what the next plan is. Here's what. But I think it's really critical to tell the why stories that underlie those things. It's not just what we're doing, but why it is that we are doing it, why you should care that we're doing it, how and why it is that we think this makes sense in a broader context, how it fits in with other policy initiatives, what's the vision for where you think this is going, and those kinds of. If you can tell those stories around the details of a policy agenda, it is both a more effective policy agenda. But also one that is more likely to have legs. It is more likely to find receptive audiences. And even if nobody listens to you, it's still there as a marker, an intellectual marker for hopefully sensible thought that people had to try to accomplish good things at the time. So I wish I tried to be very systematic about it later. when I was sitting in the chair of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security in late 19 through the end of 20 into early 2021, I went to a lot of trouble to push out this huge raft of policy papers because in part because I'd become concerned that I felt that many of my colleagues in the first Trump administration were not very engaged with clear articulations of the why stories behind what we were doing. So a lot of what we were doing I thought made a lot of sense, but people weren't really telling the story. And so, well, hell, I can do that. And by the way, it was COVID, so we weren't doing a lot of flying around and doing meetings. So, I pushed out a whole bunch of papers to try to put so much of what we were doing in that piece of this Department of State on the record from the perspective of not just what, but why. And I hope that was useful. It was certainly, I think, useful for us because it helped keep us all, I think it's actually good for managing one's own bureaucracy too. It's not just it seems less of a, arbitrary choice of policy direction when one can tell the deep embeddedness, can recount the deep embeddedness of the policy agenda in a broader framework of thinking about how things work and where you want to be going with it. And that helps keep your own team working together in the same way. So I think for ways it was good. I would give my earlier self advice to do more of that sort of deep articulation of the why stories more earlier. Which
requires, of course, the deep thinking to go with it.
Absolutely, because if you try to do that deep articulation without doing deep thinking, you look really stupid. So don't look stupid. Do a good job.
Don't look stupid. We'll end on that. Thank you very much, Chris. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
It's great to have the conversation. Thank you.